As my mother lay dying, she grabbed my hand with tears streaming down her face and whispered, "I was so wrong about everything. For 30 years. She'd chosen my sister Lydia over me in every situation, calling her the angel of the family. But the folder I found hidden in Lydia's purse that night revealed a truth so twisted, it made my mother's final words make perfect, horrible sense. The fluorescent lights in room 314 of Riverside General Hospital buzzed with that particular frequency that makes your teeth ache. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November. And I was sitting in the most uncomfortable chair known to mankind, watching my mother die. The irony wasn't lost on me that after 30 years of feeling invisible in her presence, I was the only one she could see in her final moments. My name is Autumn Hartwell, and I'm 30 years old. For 3 decades, I've been the daughter who tried too hard, the one who never quite measured up, the perpetual runner-up in the competition for my mother's affection. Tonight, I was also the only daughter who showed up when it mattered most. Lydia, my older sister by 4 years, the golden child, the angel of our family, had left the hospital around 10 p.m. She'd kissed our mother's forehead with theatrical tenderness, straightened her designer coat, and announced that she needed to get home to prepare for tomorrow's arrangements. Even in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and approaching death, Lydia managed to look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Her honey blonde hair fell in perfect waves. Her makeup was flawless despite hours of supposed grief, and her voice carried that same musical quality that had charmed everyone from teachers to boyfriends to our own mother for as long as I could remember. "Make sure you call me if anything changes," she'd said to me, not looking directly at me but somewhere over my left shoulder, as if making eye contact might somehow diminish her status. "I have the funeral director coming at 8 a.m. and the caterer at 10. Someone has to handle the important details, as if sitting with our dying mother wasn't important. As if holding vigil through the longest night of her life wasn't worthy of Lydia's precious time. But this was nothing new. This was the story of our lives, playing out one final time in room 314. I adjusted my position in the chair, trying to find a comfortable spot that didn't exist, and looked at my mother's face. Even unconscious, even diminished by the cancer that had ravaged her body for the past 8 months, Eleanor Hartwell maintained the dignified beauty that had made her the most admired woman in our small town of Millbrook. Her silver hair was still perfectly styled. Lydia had insisted on bringing her hairdresser to the hospital twice a week, because Mother would never forgive us if she looked unkempt during her final chapter. My mother's breathing was shallow, labored. The machines surrounding her bed beeped and hummed in a rhythm that had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat over the past 3 weeks. I'd been here every night since she'd taken the turn for the worse, sleeping in this chair, eating vending machine sandwiches, and watching the woman who'd shaped my entire sense of self-worth slip further and further away. Lydia visited during visiting hours, of course. She brought fresh flowers every other day, always white lilies. Mother's favorite 10 would perch elegantly on the edge of the bed, speaking in soft, melodious tones about the weather, the gossip from the country club, anything except the reality of what was happening. She never stayed past dinner time. She had a life to maintain, after all. A husband who owned 3 car dealerships across the county, twin boys who attended the most prestigious private school in the state, a house in Willowbrook Estates that was featured in Southern Living last spring. I had an apartment above the bookstore I managed downtown, a 10-year-old Honda with a questionable transmission, and a collection of houseplants that I talked to because they were better listeners than most of the people in Miley. Faye. The contrast had been established early and reinforced constantly. Lydia was the success story. I was the cautionary tale. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, it was just me, the machines, and the woman who'd given me life but had never quite figured out how to love me the way I needed to be loved. I'd been dozing when her voice cut through the mechanical sounds of the room. "Autumn." My eyes snapped open. Mother's were too, and for the first time in weeks, they were focused, clear, present in a way they hadn't been since the pain medication had been increased. "Mom," I leaned forward, my hand instinctively reaching for hers. Her fingers, once elegant and strong, now felt like bird bones wrapped in tissue paper. She turned her head toward me with obvious effort, and what I saw in her expression made my breath catch. It wasn't the usual look of vague disappointment or polite tolerance I'd grown accustomed to. It wasn't the same face she'd made when she'd compared my B-plus report cards to Lydia's straight A's, or when she'd introduced me to her friends as my other daughter while Lydia got full name recognition and a litany of accomplishments. This was something else entirely, something that looked like recognition, like she was really seeing me for the first time in 30 years. "I need to tell you something," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the hospital. I squeezed her hand gently. "What is it, Mom? Do you need me to call someone? Do you want water?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "No. Listen to me. Listen carefully." There was an urgency in her voice that made my pulse quicken. In 30 years? My mother had never spoken to me with this kind of intensity, this desperate need to be heard. "I was wrong," she said, and each word seemed to cost her enormous effort. "I was so wrong." "Wrong about what?" I asked, though part of me was afraid to hear the answer. "About everything." Tears began to gather in her eyes, and I'd seen my mother cry exactly 3 times in my entire life: at her own mother's funeral, when Lydia graduated summa cum laude from college, and the day she was diagnosed with cancer. About you, about her, about everything I believed. The tears spilled over now, tracking down her pale cheeks, and I felt something shift in my chest, a tiny crack in the armor I'd built around my heart. The protection I'd developed against years of feeling like I wasn't enough. "Mom, what are you talking about?" She tried to sit up, and I could see the monumental effort it took. I helped her, adjusting her pillows, my hands shaking slightly. Whatever this was, whatever she needed to tell me, it was important enough that she was using what might be her last reserves of strength. "I treated you terribly," she said, her voice stronger now but still fragile. "I favored her. I always favored her. I made you feel like you weren't enough, like you weren't worthy of love, and I was wrong. I was so wrong, Autumn." The words hit me like a physical blow. For 30 years, I'd wondered if I was imagining it, if I was being too sensitive, if the favoritism I perceived was just in my head. Having it acknowledged, having it confirmed by the woman who'd wielded it like a weapon for 3 decades, was both validating and devastating. "Why?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Why did you choose her over me?" My mother's face crumpled, and she was crying harder now, her frail shoulders shaking. "Because she was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, charming, successful. She made me look good. She reflected well on me." She paused, struggling with each breath. "And you were real. You were genuine. You had integrity and kindness and strength, and I was too shallow to see it. I was too concerned with appearances to recognize the gift I'd been given." I felt tears burning behind my own eyes now. This conversation, this acknowledgement I'd longed for my entire life, was happening as my mother lay dying. It felt cruel and beautiful and absolutely devastating all at once. "You were the better daughter," she continued, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "You were loyal and caring and present. You showed up when things got hard." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment I thought she might slip back into unconsciousness. "She what, Mom?" "She's not who I thought she was," my mother said, her voice taking on a strange quality. "She's not who any of us thought she was." Before I could ask what she meant, before I could process this statement that seemed to carry implications I couldn't grasp, my mother's eyes grew distant again. "I'm so tired, sweetheart," she whispered. "So very tired. Rest, Mom. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She smiled then, and it was the first time in my memory that one of my mother's smiles had been directed at me with pure, uncomplicated love. "You never did go anywhere, did you? You always stayed, even when I didn't deserve it." "I love you," I said, and meant it despite everything. "I love you too," she replied. "I should have told you that more. I should have shown you that more." Those were the last coherent words Eleanor Hartwell spoke to me. She drifted back into unconsciousness around 3:15 a.m. and she died at 6:42 a.m. as the first rays of November sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds. I held her hand as she went, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be in my mother's world, but even in that moment of bittersweet peace. Even as I processed the apology I'd waited 3 decades to hear, her words echoed. In my mind, she's not who I thought she was. She's not who any of us thought she was. What had my mother meant? What had she discovered about Lydia that had shaken her faith so completely? I wouldn't have to wait long to find out. At 7:30 a.m. 48 minutes after our mother's death, Lydia burst through the hospital room door like a force of nature. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her makeup smeared, and for the first time in my memory, she looked genuinely distraught. Is she? Lydia's voice broke off as she saw our mother's still form. She's gone, I said quietly, about an hour ago. Lydia rushed to the bedside, her designer heels clicking against the linoleum floor. She grabbed Mother's other hand, the one I wasn't holding, and let out a sob that sounded almost theatrical. I should have been here, she said, but there was something in her voice that didn't ring true. Relief, I couldn't quite identify it. She asked for you, I lied, because even now, even after everything, I couldn't bring myself to hurt my sister. At the end, Lydia's sobbing intensified, but I noticed she kept checking her watch. Even in grief, she was aware of time, of schedules, of the performance she needed to maintain. The funeral director will be here soon, she said after a few minutes, composing herself with remarkable speed, and I need to call the caterer, the florist, the minister. There's so much to do. She reached for her purse, a Hermes bag that cost more than I made in 3 months, and something fell out as she opened it. A manila folder, thick with papers, scattered across the floor. I bent to help her collect the documents, and that's when I saw it, a letterhead that made my blood run cold, an investigator's report. And at the top, in bold letters, confidential investigation. Lydia Hartwell suspected fraud and embezzlement. I stared at the paper in my hands, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. Lydia lunged for it, but I'd already seen enough. What is this? I asked, holding the paper just out of her reach. Nothing, she said quickly, too quickly. Just some business nonsense. Give it back. But I was already reading. Medical fraud. Insurance scams. Falsified documents. The report was dated 3 weeks ago, right around the time Mother had taken her turn for the worse. Lydia, I said slowly, what the hell is this? She straightened up, and in an instant, the grief-stricken daughter was gone. In her place stood someone I'd never seen before, cold, calculating, and utterly without remorse. It's none of your business, she said, her voice flat, and if you know what's good for you, you'll forget you ever saw it. But I couldn't forget. Because suddenly, my mother's final words made perfect sense. And I realized that the woman I'd spent 30 years feeling inferior to wasn't an angel at all. She was something else entirely. And our mother had died knowing the truth. Standing in that sterile hospital room, clutching the investigative report about my sister's fraud, I felt like I was looking at my entire life through a broken mirror. Every reflection was distorted, every memory suddenly questionable. But to understand how we got here, I need to take you back to the beginning. Back to when I still believed that Lydia Hartwell was everything our mother said she was, perfect, untouchable, and worthy of all the love I could never seem to earn. Growing up in Millbrook was like living inside a Norman Rockwell painting. If Norman Rockwell had painted toxic family dynamics with a smile, our house on Maple Street was the kind of place people drove by slowly, admiring the pristine gardens, the wraparound porch, and the perfect white picket fence that my father repainted every spring without fail. From the outside, we looked like the American dream personified. To successful parents, to beautiful daughters, a dog named Chester, and enough happiness to fill a holiday card. The reality was more complicated. My father, Richard Hartwell, owned Hartwell Insurance, the most successful agency in 3 counties. He was the kind of man who wore suits to backyard barbecues and never had a hair out of place. He loved my mother with the devotion of a man who'd married above his station and never forgot it. And he loved Lydia with the pride of someone who saw his own ambitions reflected and magnified in his eldest daughter. Me. He loved me too, I suppose, but it was the kind of love you give to a pleasant houseplant. Consistent, adequate, but never particularly enthusiastic. My mother, Eleanor, had been the belle of Millbrook in her youth, homecoming queen, class president. The girl everyone wanted to be or be with. She'd married my father not out of passionate love, but because he represented security and respectability. Their marriage was a transaction that had worked out well for both parties, and they'd built a life that looked exactly like what everyone expected it to look like when Lydia was born. She was like a gift from the universe to parents who valued appearance above all else. Even as a baby, she was unnaturally beautiful. Strangers would stop my mother on the street to comment on Lydia's perfect features, her bright blue eyes, her angelic disposition. By the time she was walking, my mother was entering her in beauty pageants. By kindergarten, Lydia had a wall full of trophies and a confidence that seemed to glow from within. I arrived 4 years later, and while I wasn't ugly, I wasn't Lydia either. I had my father's unremarkable brown hair, my grandmother's round face, and a tendency toward chubbiness that horrified my mother, but more than my physical appearance. It was my personality that seemed to disappoint them. Where Lydia was vivacious and charming, I was quiet and thoughtful. Where she commanded attention effortlessly, I preferred to observe from the sidelines. Where she seemed to instinctively know how to make adults smile and coo over her, I was earnest and awkward in ways that made people uncomfortable. "Autumn is such a serious child," my mother would say to her friends, and the way she said it made it clear that being serious was somehow a character flaw. Not like Lydia. Lydia just lights up every room she enters, and it was true. Lydia did light up rooms. She had a gift for making people feel like they were the most important person in the world when she focused her attention on them. Teachers adored her. Other kids wanted to be her friend. Adults competed for her approval. She was magnetic in a way that seemed effortless and natural. I learned early that my role in the family was to be Lydia's supporting cast at family gatherings. I was introduced as Lydia's little sister. At school events, teachers would light up when they realized I was related to the legendary Lydia Hartwell, then look vaguely disappointed when it became clear I hadn't inherited her special spark. Even at church, where you'd think kindness and sincerity would be valued, I was always the other Hartwell girl. But here's the thing about growing up in someone's shadow: you learn to find beauty in the darkness. While Lydia was performing for audiences, I was reading. While she was at dance recitals and beauty pageants, I was volunteering at the animal shelter. While she was learning how to charm her way through life, I was developing actual skills, actual knowledge, actual empathy. Not that anyone noticed. Lydia's successes were celebrated with family dinners and bragging sessions with the neighbors. My achievements were acknowledged with polite nods and reminders not to let them go to my head. When Lydia made homecoming court in high school, my parents threw a party. When I won the state essay contest the same year, my mother mentioned it once at dinner and then immediately shifted the conversation back to Lydia's dress for the homecoming dance. The pattern continued through college. Lydia attended Sweetbriar University, the most prestigious school in the state, studying communications with a focus on public relations. It was the perfect major for someone whose greatest talent was making people believe whatever she wanted them to believe. She joined the best sorority, dated the most eligible men, and graduated summa cum laude with a job already lined up at the state's premier PR firm. I went to Millbrook State, a perfectly respectable but decidedly unglamorous public university 20 minutes from home. I studied literature and education, planning to become a teacher. My parents attended my graduation, but spent most of the ceremony talking about Lydia's upcoming wedding to Brandon Montgomery, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in the county. The wedding was everything you'd expect from Lydia. Elegant, expensive, and perfect in every way that mattered to our social circle. I was the maid of honor, dressed in a pale pink gown that made me look like an overstuffed cupcake, standing next to my radiant sister who looked like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. The local newspaper ran a full-page spread about the wedding of the year, with multiple photos of Lydia and Brandon looking like they'd been carved from marble by Renaissance masters. There was one photo of me in the entire spread, partially hidden behind a floral arrangement, looking uncomfortable and out of place. After the wedding, Lydia and Brandon bought the house in Willowbrook Estates, a sprawling colonial with more bathrooms than most people have rooms. Lydia quit her job to focus on being a wife and, eventually, a mother. When the twins were born 3 years later, my mother practically moved in to help care for her precious grandbabies. I, meanwhile, had graduated with my teaching degree and taken a job at Millbrook Elementary. I loved working with children, loved seeing their faces light up when they finally understood a difficult concept, loved being the person who helped them discover that learning could be joyful. But teaching wasn't glamorous. It didn't pay well. It didn't come with a big house or a prestigious husband or the kind of success that photographed well for Christmas cards. "It's such a shame," my mother would say to her bridge club friends, not knowing I could hear her from the kitchen. "Autumn has such potential, but she just doesn't seem to want more for herself. Not like Lydia. Lydia has always known how to reach for the stars." What my mother didn't understand was that I had reached for something. I'd reached for authenticity, for work that mattered, for a life that felt genuine rather than performed. But in our family, authenticity was a poor substitute for achievement, and achievement was measured solely by external markers of success. The dynamic crystallized completely about 5 years ago when I was 25 and still living in my small apartment above Henderson's bookstore. Working as both a teacher and the evening manager of the shop, Lydia was living her picture-perfect life with her picture-perfect family, appearing in the society pages regularly and serving on the boards of various charitable organizations. I'd been dating someone, a fellow teacher named David, who was kind and funny and completely unimpressed by status or money. We'd been together for 2 years, and I thought we might have a future together. But when I brought him to Sunday dinner at my parents' house, the contrast between my modest, genuine relationship and Lydia's glamorous marriage was stark. "David teaches 5th grade too," my mother explained to Lydia, as if this were somehow embarrassing. "Isn't that nice, to teachers?" The way she said it made it sound like we were playing house rather than building a real relationship. Lydia, meanwhile, spent the entire dinner talking about Brandon's latest business acquisition, their upcoming vacation to Europe, and the renovations they were planning for their already perfect home. She was gracious to David. Of course, Lydia was always gracious, but there was something in her smile that made it clear she saw him as quaint, provincial, temporary. She was right about the temporary part, though not for the reasons she assumed. David broke up with me 3 months later, not because he was intimidated by my family's wealth, but because he couldn't handle watching them diminish me every time we were together. "You become smaller around them," he told me on the night he ended things. "It's like you think you deserve to be treated as less than. And I can't watch someone I care about disappear like that." He was right, of course. I had learned to make myself smaller, quieter, less significant in order to avoid the disappointment in my parents' eyes when I failed to measure up to Lydia's standard. I had internalized their message so completely that I'd begun to believe it myself. But even knowing all of this, even understanding the dysfunction at the heart of our family, I couldn't seem to break free from it. This was my normal. This was the only version of love I'd ever known, and despite everything, despite the decades of feeling like a consolation prize in my own family, I kept showing up. I kept trying. I kept hoping that someday, somehow, I'd find a way to earn the unconditional love that Lydia received simply by existing. That's why, when my mother got sick 8 months ago, I was the one who rearranged my life to care for her. Lydia visited, of course, bringing flowers and good intentions, but she had responsibilities. A husband to support, children to raise, a social calendar to maintain. I just had my little job and my little apartment and my little life that could be easily rearranged around cancer appointments and hospital stays. I don't know what we'd do without Autumn. My mother told the nurses, but there was resignation in her voice rather than gratitude. As if my availability was simply another sign of how limited my life was compared to Lydia's full, important existence. And I accepted it all. The lack of recognition, the casual dismissal. The assumption that my time was less valuable because my life was less impressive. I accepted it because this was my family, and in our family, Lydia was the star and I was the understudy who never expected to take the stage, until last night. when everything I thought I knew about our family's story turned out to be a carefully constructed lie. Standing in that hospital room, holding evidence of my sister's crimes, I realized that for 30 years I'd been living in someone else's version of reality. A version where Lydia was the angel and I was the disappointment. A version where success was measured by appearance rather than integrity. A version where love was conditional and always scarce. But that version was about to crumble completely. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to see what was underneath. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.